One of them is Bobo, riding his father's horse, and the other is Herman Lehman, who used to live on a German-speaking ranch in Texas, but is now a member of the Apache tribe and has only vague memories of his old life. On May 16, 1870, Herman and his brothers were trying to chase birds in a wheat field. Unexpectedly, they became the target of Apache forces. Herman and his 8-year-old brother Willie were captured in the raid. While Willie was able to escape after a few days, Herman remained trapped and was unable to escape the raiders. Life among the Apaches was difficult, even after he was incorporated into the family. The harsh environment of West Texas with its arid land and ongoing conflicts with Americans, Mexicans, and other tribes made life difficult and sometimes violent for everyone. Nevertheless, Herman initially felt as though he belonged to the Apache tribe. Still, he never became a full Apache. Every time he heard the new name Ender, this fact was emphasized. The conflict between the Comanches and the Apaches began in the early 18th century and lasted for nearly a century. In a bitter war, the Comanches succeeded in driving the Lipan and Mescalero Apaches from the plains. The ongoing hostility between these groups was reflected in the derogatory names they used for each other. The Comanches called the Mescalero Apaches and the Lipan Essequitas, meaning gray dung. In turn, the Apaches called the Comanches Indocene, from the Indus, meaning enemy. This historical context highlights the deep and long-standing nature of the conflict between the two nations, marked by territorial conflicts and cultural differences. As the sun rises, two young Apache hunters ride quietly up the hill, careful not to scare the animals. One of them is Bobo, riding his father's horse, and the other is Herman Lehman, who lives on a German-speaking ranch in Texas, but is now a member of the Apache tribe and has only vague memories of his old life. On May 16, 1870, Herman and his brothers were trying to hunt birds in a wheat field. Against all odds, they became targets of Apache forces. Herman and his 8-year-old brother Willie were captured during the raid. While Willie escaped for several days, Herman was trapped and unable to escape the raiders. Life was hard for the Apaches, even after he became a member of the family. The harsh environment of West Texas, with its barren lands and constant conflict with Americans, Mexicans, and other tribes, made life difficult and sometimes violent for everyone. Yet Herman initially felt a sense of belonging to the Apache tribe. He never became an official Apache, however. Every time he heard the new name Ender, that fact was reinforced. Male mortality was high, the result of frequent fighting, contrasting with relatively low birth rates, and miscarriages were common among peoples who were frequently tied to horses. Raids often ended in the theft of horses and goods, as well as the destruction of homes and crops. The Apaches, faced with one of the most brutal Comanche raids, lost much of their memory of history. Their rapid retreat from Texas reflected the ferocity of the raids. Despite the challenges, the Apaches adapted and survived in new lands where game was less plentiful. Herman and Bobo set out from camp one morning, feeling relatively safe from Comanche raids. Sure, they were far into western Comanche territory, their main concern was to avoid disturbing the fight and find their way back. Suddenly, the boys heard the sound of approaching hooves and realized they were not from their village. Before they could discuss their origins, a group of Comanche warriors appeared. 0555.
At the foot of the ridge, the Apache boys had only one choice: to flee quickly to defend themselves.
Bobo's fast, well-trained horse charged toward the village at full speed. Herman's mule, on the other hand, was less cooperative. Despite the beatings it had endured, the stubborn and nervous mule still displayed strange behavior at this crucial moment. As Herman pushed it toward the Apache village, the mule spun in circles with no apparent direction. In desperation, Herman called to Bobo for help, but the panicked rider, on his fast horse, ran toward the Apache village without looking back. After a few turns, a Comanche arrow hit the mule in the side, knocking it out of the circle in panic. It galloped toward the Apache village, Herman clinging desperately to him. The mule passed Bobo, driven by fear, and took the lead from the young man who was shouting not to be left behind. Male mortality was high due to frequent fighting, in contrast to the relatively low birth rates and frequent miscarriages of peoples who were more closely related to horses. Raids often ended in the theft of horses and goods, as well as the destruction of homes and crops. The Apaches, faced with one of the most brutal Comanche raids, lost much of their historical memory. Their rapid retreat from Texas reflected the ferocity of the raids. Despite the challenges, the Apaches adapted and survived in new lands where game was less plentiful. Herman and Bobo set out from camp one morning, feeling relatively safe from Comanche raids. Sure, they had ventured deep into western Comanche territory, but their main concern was not to disrupt the fighting and find their way back. Suddenly, the boys heard the sound of approaching horses and realized they were not from their village. Before they could discuss their origins, a group of Comanche warriors appeared. At the foot of the ridge, the Apache boys had only one choice: to flee quickly back to their village to warn the tribe to defend themselves. Bobo's fast, well-trained horse charged toward the village at full speed. Herman's mule, on the other hand, was less cooperative. Despite the beating it had endured, the stubborn and anxious mule behaved strangely at this crucial moment. As Herman pushed it toward the Apache village, the mule spun in circles with no apparent direction. In desperation, Herman called out to Bobo for help, but the panicked rider sped off toward the Apache village without looking back. After a few turns, a Comanche arrow hit the mule in the side, causing it to bolt out of the circle in panic. It galloped toward the Apache village, Herman clinging desperately to him. The mule overtook Bobo, driven by fear, and took the head of the young man who was screaming not to be left behind. They also took away abandoned horses, contrary to the Apache custom of giving fallen warriors a proper burial. The Comanches were not treated with respect. Their bodies were rounded up and left to be eaten by scavengers such as coyotes and vultures. To avoid confrontation with the Comanches, the Apaches quickly attacked and moved north. Scouts were sent out to search for the hiding Comanches and found 2 spies. One of them was shot and the other captured. The captured spy was treated harshly by Canoviste, his adoptive father and village chief. The Comanche warrior had holes in his hands, a rope was threaded through them, and he was hanged from a tree. Herman later told a surprising story in which an old Apache, whose nose had been cut off, felt sorry for the captured Comanche. Contrary to popular belief, this old Apache secretly killed the Comanche, thus showing a different side. The Apache group reached a stream about 60 miles from their camp, and it took them several days to deal with their feelings of grief and anger. One morning, an elderly Apache man had a terrifying dream in which he was being chased by a large group of Comanches. He told the carnivist about his dream, and the village elders held a long fasting meeting to decide what to do next. They knew the Comanche threat was still there. Most of the Apaches decided it was best to make a strategic retreat, leaving the area to avoid further losses from the continuing Comanche threat. With the agreement of the carnival and the village elders, they quickly moved the village, leaving the first priority behind. Once again, the horses and mules were quickly attacked as the Apaches moved west, moving silently through terrain that offered little in the way of tactical cover. After 20 miles, doubts arose. Perhaps all this preparation was an overreaction to the ramblings of a sleep-deprived old man. Suddenly, the scene transformed as dozens of Comanche warriors appeared seemingly from nowhere, invading the once empty horizon. The Apaches defended themselves fiercely, firing arrows, but within minutes, the small band of Apaches had suffered heavy losses. 40 warriors were killed, and most of the women and children were captured by the Comanches, who also took all their horses, food, and equipment. Despite significant losses on both sides, about 100 Apache warriors, along with 6 women, managed to escape on foot. They wandered the wilderness for a month, barely surviving on very little food and water. Eventually, Herman and the survivors encountered another formidable band of Comanches, 150 strong and well-armed. Sharing their harrowing stories, a call went out across Apache territory for bands to meet at a famous site, the Apache Scouts, a globally recognized dry lake bed. Warriors came from as far away as Utah, Arizona, and Mexico. The camp was abuzz with activity as warriors made arrows, hardened spearheads, cleaned rifles, and reinforced shields. Collectively, the Apaches decided that they could no longer tolerate the relentless invasion of the Comanches. It was time for their people to unite and take revenge on the Comanches, who had long mistreated them. Many felt they had reached a point of no return, a point where coexistence was no longer tenable, and the Apaches were determined to destroy the Comanches and reclaim their homeland. Their hatred of the Comanches was so deep that even women and children were required to perform repeated drills on weapon use and escape routes, preparing for the great battle that was to come. At a crucial moment, he is approached by Apaches and Comanches, with the legendary Chief Victorio and the military leader and medicine man Geronimo joining the camp, ready for war. Demonstrating his legendary status, Victorio volunteers to lead a trusted scouting party west in a preliminary search for Comanches in the territory. As the days pass and more Apaches arrive at the camp, preparing for a potential conflict, there is still no sign of Victorio's scouting party. Victorio finally returns to camp, barely keeping his horse. Unfortunately, he shares the news that all of his companions have been killed, and the Comanches now know the Apaches are in their territory. At another meeting, Victorio, Geronimo, Carno Visit, and other leaders discussed the way forward. Victorio proposed making peace with the Comanches, emphasizing the need for the tribes to unite against their common enemy, the whites. He warned of internal strife and emphasized the support the whites were providing the Comanches by providing them with weapons and ammunition. Red Wasp, another chief, disagreed, saying they should not fear the pale-face. He listed the injustices committed by the whites, from the confiscation of their hunting grounds to the spread of disease, and called for resistance, prepared to fight the Comanches to the bitter end. After a long discussion, they decided to make a truce with the Comanches. They hoped that peace between the two tribes would unite them against the relentless invasion of the white man, whether Texan, American, Mexican, or Spanish. The next day, the Apaches, carrying a white flag of truce, approached the Comanche camp within 3 miles. A Comanche warrior advanced toward them, circled them at a safe distance, taunted them, and waved a black shield, a clear challenge to a deadly duel. At a crucial moment, the Apaches could have returned the challenge with a red shield, accepted the challenge, and charged into battle. Surprisingly, the Apache horsemen approached unarmed, still carrying the white flag of truce.
The stunned Comanches signaled for 6 of their men to meet the 6 Apache representatives between the two sides.
6 Apache men had been selected for this diplomatic mission and set out to meet the Comanches. Surprisingly, the Comanches expressed a willingness to make peace on the condition that the Apaches responsible for the mistreatment of their people would be brought to justice. The Apache messengers, knowing the Comanches, mentioned the cannibal chief who was still alive and well, and informed them that the Apache responsible had unfortunately been killed in the previous battle. Although discouraged, the Comanches agreed to drop the issue, opting for a formal unified peace for both sides. On the basis of this fragile misinformation, the truce was officially announced. The women and children who had been captured earlier were happily reunited with their Apache families. Tears of joy were shed. Some Apache women, willingly or not, chose to stay with the Comanches, forming marriages to strengthen the bond between the two tribes. Even the old, noseless woman who had shot the Comanche left, and Herman did not feel sad about her departure. Ultimately, Herman credited Victorio with paving the way for peace between the two tribes. However, their plan to unite and retaliate was not carried out. Victorio's diplomatic skills in this situation showed exceptional leadership. Although this story ends well, there were many instances of conflicts like this before and after that caused much bloodshed and suffering. Herman stayed with his tribe for 6 years, but was forced to leave after avenging the death of Carnovisti by killing a medicine man, which led to his exile. He hid for a year, surviving in the difficult area between the Pecos River and the Rio Grande. Eventually, loneliness and need drove him to seek out the Comanche tribe. When Herman shared his story with them, they welcomed him and called him Monteshena,